The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast a pale glow on the bustling corridors. Nurses and doctors moved with practiced urgency, their voices blending into a low hum of activity. For Lila Carter, a nurse in her late 20s, this was just another shift. She thrived in the predictable rhythm of her work, finding solace in her ability to make a difference in her patients' lives. That evening, as she reviewed the day's patient roster, a new name caught her attention. Henry Wallace, 58 years old, admitted for chest pains. The file was sparse. No emergency contacts, no listed family members. It wasn't unusual for patients to come in alone. But something about the emptiness of his file struck her. When Lila entered room 214, she found Henry sitting by the window, the hospital gown hanging loosely on his lean frame. He was staring out at the city's skyline, the rain creating streaks on the glass that mirrored the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. He didn't turn when she walked in. "Good evening, Mr. Wallace?" Lila greeted, her tone warm but professional. He finally glanced over his shoulder, his eyes a piercing shade of blue that held an unmistakable sadness. "Henry," he corrected, his voice low and gravelly. "No need for formalities." Lila stepped closer, her footsteps soft against the tile floor. "All right, Henry. I'm Lila, your nurse tonight. I'm here to check on you and make sure you're comfortable." He nodded faintly, but didn't say anything, his gaze returning to the window. Lila began her routine, checking his vitals and reviewing his chart. As she worked, she noticed small details: a scar on his hand, a frayed bracelet around his wrist, and the way his fingers tapped lightly against the bed frame, as if trying to fill the silence. "You've had a rough day, haven't you?" Lila asked gently, hoping to draw him out. Henry let out a dry chuckle, though it lacked any real humor. "You could say that. Do you have anyone I can call for you? A family member or friend?" she ventured. He shook his head. "There's no one," he said simply, his tone flat. Lila hesitated, her instincts urging her to dig deeper, but she knew better than to push too hard. "Well, you've got me for now," she said with a small smile. "And I'm a pretty good listener if you ever feel like talking." Henry didn't respond, but the faint softening of his expression told her that her words hadn't gone unheard. As Lila left his room and walked back to the nurse's station, she couldn't shake the image of Henry sitting alone by the window. Something about him felt heavy, as though he were carrying more than just the burden of his physical ailment. Over the years, Lila had cared for many patients who were alone, but Henry's loneliness felt different, profound, almost palpable. She glanced at his file again, hoping to find a clue that might explain the emptiness surrounding him. But there was nothing, just a series of medical notes and a vague mention of prior hospital visits. "Another tough one?" her colleague Mara asked, noticing the thoughtful look on Lila's face. "Something like that," Lila replied. "He just seems so lost." Mara shrugged. "Sometimes people don't want to be found. All we can do is make them comfortable." Lila nodded, but her gut told her there was more to Henry's story, and she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he needed more than just comfort. He needed someone to care. The next evening, as Lila returned for her shift, she made a point to check on Henry first. She found him in the same position, sitting by the window as if glued there. The tray of untouched food on his bedside table told her he hadn't eaten. "Still raining out there?" she asked, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "Looks like it," Henry replied, his tone distant. Lila leaned forward slightly, trying to catch his eye. "You know, you'll heal faster if you eat something," she said, gesturing to the tray. Henry finally looked at her, a flicker of annoyance in his gaze. "I'm not hungry." "Fair enough," Lila said, unfazed. "But humor me. What's your favorite meal? If you could eat anything right now, What would it be? Henry's lips twitched, as if fighting a smile. Lasagna, he said after a pause. But not the kind they serve here. Noted, Lila said with a grin. I'll see what I can do. That small exchange marked the beginning of a shift in their interactions. Over the next few days, Lila made it a point to spend a few extra minutes with Henry during each check-in. She brought him crossword puzzles from the break room, extra blankets when the nights grew cold, and even smuggled in a slice of lasagna from the cafeteria. You're persistent. I'll give you that, Henry said one evening, though there was a hint of warmth in his voice. It's part of the job, Lila replied lightly, but I'm glad you noticed. Henry's gaze softened, and for the first time, Lila saw a glimmer of something beneath his sadness, a flicker of gratitude, perhaps even hope. On her fourth night with Henry, as she adjusted his IV line, he surprised her with a question. Why do you do this? Do what? Lila asked, glancing up. Care, he said simply. For people you don't even know. Lila paused, considering her answer. Because everyone deserves someone to care about them, she said honestly. And because sometimes a little kindness can make all the difference. Henry nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. You're a rare one, Lila. She smiled, but his words stayed with her long after she left his room. For the first time, she felt as though she was beginning to understand him, not fully, but enough to know that his loneliness ran deeper than she had imagined. As Lila clocked out that night, her thoughts remained on Henry. What had led him to this place, so isolated and burdened? And why did he seem so resigned to his loneliness? She resolved to find out, not out of curiosity, but because she genuinely wanted to help. Little did she know, the answers she sought would change everything and leave her questioning the very nature of compassion and forgiveness. The next morning, Lila started her shift with a stop by Henry's room. She found him awake, sitting upright for a change, and flipping absent-mindedly through a hospital brochure. His breakfast tray was untouched. Good morning, Henry, Lila said brightly, placing a fresh blanket on the chair beside his bed. I see you're an early riser. He glanced up, his lips quirking in what might have been an attempt at a smile. Old habits die hard, he said. Not much else to do these days. Well, if you're up for it, I brought you something. She held up a slim book, an anthology of jazz history she had grabbed from the hospital's small library. Thought this might be up your alley. Henry hesitated before reaching for the book. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and for a moment, his expression softened. You remembered, he said, referring to their earlier conversation about his love for jazz. Of course, Lila replied, pulling up a chair. So, who's your favorite artist? He chuckled, a sound that was more breath than voice. Duke Ellington. Nobody could play like him. For the next few minutes, they talked about music, Lila asking questions and Henry slowly opening up, his words revealing glimpses of a man who had once been vibrant and passionate. By the time she left, the book was open on his lap, his attention fully absorbed. That afternoon, as Lila made her rounds, she noticed something unusual. Henry's breakfast tray was empty. She paused at his door, peeking inside to find him thumbing through the book she'd brought, a rare look of contentment on his face. Well, she teased, stepping inside. Either you've developed an appetite, or the food here isn't as bad as you've been claiming. Henry looked up, a faint twinkle in his eye. Don't push your luck. Lila laughed, but inwardly, she felt a swell of satisfaction. This small change, this tiny spark of engagement, felt like a victory. As the days passed, Henry began to speak more freely during their conversations. He shared stories of his youth, painting vivid pictures of smoky jazz clubs and late-night jam sessions with friends. He talked about his work as a carpenter, his pride evident as he described the intricate designs he had crafted over the years. But when the subject turned to his family, Henry's words faltered. He spoke in vague terms, mentioning a wife who had passed on and a son he hadn't seen in years. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Lila didn't press him, sensing that the wounds were still raw. "You're a good listener," Henry said one evening, breaking a long silence. "It's part of the job," Lila replied with a smile. "But I think you've got a lot worth listening to." Henry chuckled softly. "You're too kind, Lila. Not many people would bother with an old man like me." "That's where you're wrong," she said. "Everyone deserves kindness." Henry. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Lila made it a point to visit Henry during her breaks, sometimes bringing small treats from the cafeteria or sharing updates about her life outside the hospital. In turn, Henry began to share more of himself, stories of love, loss, and the quiet regrets that had shaped his life. One evening, as she adjusted his IV, Henry surprised her with a question. "Do you believe in second chances?" Lila paused, meeting his gaze. "I think everyone deserves one," she said. "Why do you ask?" Henry hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his blanket. "Just thinking about the past," he said finally. "Things I wish I could have done differently." "You can't change the past," Lila said gently, "but you can still make things right." Henry nodded slowly, though his expression remained distant. Lila sensed that there was more he wasn't saying, but she knew better than to push. She decided to wait, trusting that he would open up when he was ready. One afternoon, as Lila entered Henry's room with his lunch tray, she found him on the phone, his voice low and urgent. He didn't notice her at first, and she paused in the doorway, not wanting to intrude. "I told you I don't want to talk about it," he said, his tone uncharacteristically sharp. "Just leave it alone." He ended the call abruptly, his hands trembling as he set the phone down on the bedside table. When he looked up and saw Lila, his expression softened, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Henry forced a smile. "Just an old friend. Nothing to worry about." But Lila wasn't convinced. The shadows in his eyes told a different story. That evening, as Lila walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Henry had made so much progress over the past week, but the phone call seemed to have unsettled him. She replayed the conversation in her mind, wondering who he had been speaking to and why it had affected him so deeply. Despite her growing concern, Lila resolved to approach the situation carefully. She knew that trust was fragile, and the last thing she wanted was to push Henry away. But as she prepared for her next shift, she couldn't help but feel that she was on the brink of uncovering something significant, something that would change the way she saw him forever. The next day, as Lila arrived at the hospital for her shift, she noticed a man lingering near the main entrance. He was in his late 30s, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, but his impatient pacing and frequent glances at the hospital doors gave him away as someone not entirely at ease. Lila didn't think much of it until later that afternoon, when she spotted the same man outside Henry's room. He stood by the door, hesitant, as if unsure whether to knock. Curious. Lila approached him. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her tone polite but cautious. "I'm here to see Henry Wallace," the man replied. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension. "Is he awake?" Lila hesitated. "Are you family?" The man's jaw tightened. "I'm a friend," he said, though his hesitation suggested otherwise. Lila wasn't convinced, but she nodded. Let me check with him first. When Lila stepped into Henry's room and mentioned the visitor, his face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks, and his hands clenched the edges of the blanket. Tell him to leave, Henry said quickly, his voice trembling. I don't want to see him. Henry, are you sure? He said he's a friend. He's not. Henry snapped, though the fear in his eyes overshadowed his anger. Just, please, tell him to go. Lila nodded, her concern deepening. She returned to the man in the hallway and relayed Henry's message. The man didn't seem surprised. Instead, he sighed heavily, as though he'd expected this outcome. Tell him I'll be back, he said before turning and walking away. Later that evening, Lila sat by Henry's bedside, her curiosity burning. Henry, who was that man? She asked gently. He seemed determined to see you. Henry didn't respond at first, staring at the ceiling as if hoping the question would disappear. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. That man. His name is Marcus. He's my son. Lila's breath caught. Your son? Henry nodded, his eyes clouded with emotion. We haven't spoken in years. Not since everything fell apart. What happened? Lila asked softly, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. Henry hesitated, then exhaled heavily. I wasn't a good father, he admitted. Not when it mattered most. After his mother died, I threw myself into work. I thought I was doing the right thing, providing for him, but I wasn't there for him when he needed me, and by the time I realized that, it was too late. Henry's confession was raw, each word weighted with years of guilt. He told Lila how Marcus had grown resentful, feeling abandoned and unloved. Their relationship had deteriorated over time, culminating in a heated argument that ended with Marcus walking out and never coming back. I tried to reach out, Henry said, his voice breaking. I called, I wrote letters, but he never responded. I don't blame him. I failed him. Lila placed a hand on his arm, her heart heavy with empathy. Henry, it sounds like you tried, and he came here today. That has to mean something. Henry shook his head. It doesn't change what I did. Some wounds don't heal. That night, Lila couldn't stop thinking about Henry's story. She thought of the man she had seen outside his room, the way he had looked. Not angry, but conflicted. There was more to this story than Henry was willing to admit, and Lila felt a growing need to help. The next morning, during her break, she searched the hospital records and found Marcus's contact information. After some hesitation, she dialed his number. The phone rang several times before he answered. Hello? Hi. Mr. Wallace. Lila began, her voice steady. My name is Lila Carter. I'm a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about your father. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What about him? He's not doing well, Lila said carefully. I know things are complicated between you two, but I think he wants to make things right. Marcus let out a bitter laugh. He has a funny way of showing it. I know he hurt you, Lila said, her tone sincere. But I've seen how much he regrets what happened. He talks about you all the time. Marcus. I think he's just scared. Another pause, then a sigh. I'll think about it, Marcus said before hanging up. That evening, Lila didn't mention the phone call to Henry, not wanting to get his hopes up, but she couldn't help feeling optimistic. Marcus hadn't rejected the idea outright, and that alone felt like progress. When she entered Henry's room, she found him sitting by the window, the jazz book open on his lap. He looked up as she approached, his expression softening. "Thanks for not pushing earlier," he said. "About Marcus." "You're welcome," Lila replied, pulling up a chair. "But for what it's worth, I think you should give him a chance. He came all the way here. Henry, that means something." Henry didn't respond, but the thoughtful look in his eyes suggested her words had struck a chord. As the night wore on, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was reaching a turning point. The strained relationship between Henry and Marcus was like a fragile thread, one that could either mend or break completely. She hoped with all her heart that it would be the former. But deep down, she knew that reconciliation wouldn't come easily, and that the truth still had more to reveal. 2 days after her conversation with Marcus, Lila returned to work with a nervous anticipation. She hadn't heard back from him, and wasn't sure if he had taken her words to heart. Henry, meanwhile, seemed quieter than usual, retreating further into himself. The thought of Marcus's absence weighed on him, even if he refused to admit it. Later that afternoon, as Lila prepared Henry's medication, she heard a knock at the door. She turned to find Marcus standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets and his expression unreadable. "You came," she said, relief washing over her. Marcus nodded. "I'm not sure why," he admitted, glancing past her to the man lying in the hospital bed. "But I'm here." Lila smiled softly and stepped aside. "Go talk to him. He's been waiting for this." Marcus entered the room slowly, as if each step toward his father carried the weight of years of resentment and hurt. Henry looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, neither man spoke. "Marcus," Henry said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus crossed his arms, standing at the foot of the bed. "You don't look so good." "Dad?" Henry chuckled dryly. "You always had a way with words?" The tension in the room was palpable, but Lila could see the cracks in their guarded expressions. Beneath the anger and pain, there was something else. Something softer. "I'll give you two some privacy," Lila said, stepping out into the hallway. But she lingered nearby, listening as their voices rose and fell, alternating between sharp accusations and hesitant apologies. When Lila checked on them an hour later, the atmosphere had shifted. Marcus was sitting in the chair by Henry's bed, his posture more relaxed, though his expression remained guarded. "I'm sorry," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I was a terrible father. Marcus, I see that now." "You don't get to say that and expect everything to be okay," Marcus replied, his tone sharp, but then his voice softened. "But I appreciate you saying it." Henry nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I don't expect anything, son. I didn't want to leave this world without trying to make things right." The days that followed brought slow but meaningful progress. Marcus began visiting regularly, their conversations growing less strained with each interaction. They talked about Henry's work as a carpenter, Marcus's career in finance, and the small memories they both still cherished. Camping trips, shared meals, and quiet evenings spent listening to jazz records. Lila watched their bond begin to mend with a quiet sense of pride. She had seen many patients and families struggle with unresolved pain, but few had the courage to confront it head-on. Henry and Marcus weren't just healing their relationship, they were healing themselves. One evening, as Lila prepared to end her shift, Henry called her into his room. Marcus had left earlier, and the room was quiet except for the faint hum of medical equipment. "Lila," Henry began, his voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." She pulled up a chair, sensing the gravity of his words. "What is it?" Henry hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I'm dying." Lila's heart clenched. Henry? I didn't want to say anything before, he continued, his voice breaking. I didn't want Marcus to feel like he had to come back out of pity. But the truth is, I don't have much time left. Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but she reached out and took his hand. You've done something incredible. Henry, she said. You've given him a chance to know the man you are now. That's a gift. Henry nodded, his expression a mixture of sadness and gratitude. I just hope it's enough. The next day, Lila found Marcus waiting outside Henry's room, his expression troubled. He told me, Marcus said, his voice tight, about his condition. I'm so sorry, Lila said, her heart aching for both of them. Marcus shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. I wasted so much time being angry, and now there's barely any time left. There's still time to make memories, Lila said softly. That's what matters. Encouraged by her words, Marcus spent the next few days by Henry's side, talking, laughing, and even listening to old jazz records on a portable speaker Lila brought in. They shared stories they hadn't told in years, finding comfort in the moments they had left. One quiet evening, as the sun set outside the hospital window, Henry turned to Marcus. I want you to know how proud I am of you, he said, his voice steady despite his frailty. I don't say it enough, maybe I never did, but I've always been proud. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. I know, Dad, and I'm proud of you too. Henry smiled faintly, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep. Marcus stayed by his side, holding his hand, as the last rays of sunlight faded into twilight. The hospital room grew quieter as Henry's condition declined. His once steady voice became faint, and his movements slower. Yet, in these moments of fragility, there was an undeniable sense of peace. Marcus stayed by his father's side, often holding his hand and sharing memories that had long been buried under years of resentment. Lila continued to visit regularly, her presence a source of comfort for both men. She brought fresh flowers for the room and played Duke Ellington's albums softly on a portable speaker, the music filling the space with warmth. One evening, as the sun cast golden light across the room, Henry looked at Marcus and said, I've been given more than I deserve. Thank you for forgiving me. Marcus shook his head, his eyes glistening. We both made mistakes, Dad, but we found our way back to each other. That's what matters. It was a calm Sunday morning when Henry passed away, his son by his side. Lila arrived just moments later, the air in the room heavy with the stillness of finality. Marcus stood by the window, his shoulders slumped but his expression soft. He went peacefully, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. He was ready. Lila placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. He was proud of you. Marcus, more than you'll ever know. Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. He told me, and I'll carry that with me. In the days following Henry's passing, Marcus made arrangements for his father's funeral. He invited Lila, thanking her for everything she had done, not just for Henry, but for him as well. You gave us something we didn't think we'd ever have, Marcus said during a quiet moment at the funeral, a second chance. It wasn't just me, Lila replied, her voice filled with emotion. You both found the courage to face the past and move forward. That's not easy. As the service concluded, Marcus approached Lila once more. I'd like to stay in touch, he said. I want to keep that connection alive, not just with my father's memory, but with the people who mattered to him. Lila smiled. I'd like that too. Weeks turned into months, and life at St. Mary's Hospital returned to its usual rhythm. Lila continued her work, finding solace in the care she provided to others. But Henry's memory stayed with her, a reminder of the impact one person's kindness could have. One day, she received a package in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter from Marcus, along with a small box. The letter read, "Dear Lila, thank you for being the bridge that brought my father and me back together. I'll never forget what you did for us. Inside this box is something my father wanted you to have. He said it reminded him of you, your compassion, your patience, and your unwavering belief in second chances. With gratitude, Marcus." Inside the box was a small wooden carving, a delicate rose, its petals etched with intricate detail. Lila recognized it immediately as Henry's handiwork. Tears filled her eyes as she held the carving, her mind flooded with memories of Henry and the bond they had shared. She placed the rose on her bedside table, a symbol of the lives she had touched and the legacy Henry had left behind. That evening, as Lila walked through the hospital corridors, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Henry's story had taught her that even in the face of pain and regret, there was always room for hope and redemption. And as she entered another patient's room, ready to offer the same kindness and care she had shown Henry, she knew that his legacy would live on, not just in Marcus, but in her as well.